Many of you here know Mike personally. He came to work for Burnley Council in 1995 to manage community centers and leisure activities initially, and then he stayed on. From 2003 through 2018, his council job included responsibility for race relations. I'm not sure that this knowledge of him or even just conversations with him will prepare you for how good Mike's book is. I've spoken with Mike many times online, and that certainly didn't prepare me for what I read. On Burnley Road is clear, it's direct, it's eloquent, it's comprehending of people Mike doesn't agree with and sometimes doesn't like. It's curious about everyone. What makes you think that, Mike always asks? When you say that thing that I think is wrong or offensive, what is it that you want that lies behind that? Mike, I'm actually looking forward to the political novel that I hope you're working on. There's a sense of the psychology that lies behind people's behavior that is really quite unusual for a work that's really about political history. The book has a profound connection to all of the people involved in Burnley's political disputes. I always knew while reading which side Mike is on. There's no waffling when, for example, the British National Party falsely claimed that Burnley Council waived council tax if you had a prayer rug in your home. And Mike calls everything by its name, including and especially racism. At the same time, he gives full credit to the strategy, the relationships, the community roots, and the feelings of everyone, even when ones that he regarded as misguided and destructive. I felt like that you as my narrator are impartial in the sense that you are engaged in a continuous effort to be impartial, that I could trust your account because I could see your own beliefs, that you weren't being cagey, in fact, about those, and also that you had done the hard work to understand how every side viewed the situation. The book pulls no punches. It lays out the entire landscape of thought of the people clashing by day and night. So I guess what I'm really trying to say is it's a great read, and we have copies up in the front. There's also a bookstore laid out there and an open bar, which is something I'll remind you about again shortly. Our panel may well connect the book to current events, so let me add a couple of additional things about the background that lies behind it that comes up in the book. Mike puts the local scene ahead of the national one. To quote him, the media usually cover council elections as if they were mere rehearsals for general elections. In fact, many new directions and developments can first be seen in local situations, and national politics are produced from accumulations and combinations of local realities. So reading Mike, I had the feeling that history starts in Burnley and not in Westminster, and gets to Westminster much later in the day. I think this is an important point about British politics in general. Another matter is Mike's sense of the history of work and of working people in Burnley and in Lancashire. He has a chapter on the cotton industry in the 19th and 20th centuries. Again, he pulls no punches about the underlying system. Burnley's working class was formed in the age of empire, he writes, and also notes with typical directness that dispossession of peoples from the world beyond was a condition of local economic development. Mike equally focuses on the long hours for low pay in Burnley, on how hard Burnley people had to fight for generations for that local economic development, which was never handed to them and most often withheld. He honors working class lives, their friendly societies, cooperative stores, and other mutualist initiatives, churches and chapels and mosques, and local governments and festivals, in all their radical politics and their conservatism. The impression is of the dignity and power of Burnley's battle to survive and thrive, where everything must be built more or less locally with the community's hands and brains. These hands and brains are as much Asian British or Caribbean British as they are white. Mike describes a divided and conflictual past that can be used to move forward into the future, where moving forward rests on our power to falsify lies, to confront each other across conflict slowly and patiently, and to correct our mistakes in a way that Mike's book does on pretty much every page. As noted, we're from the ISRF, which supports research on real world problems. with On Burnley Road as an outstanding example. One of our programs is the Independent Scholars Fellowship, developed for people who need to do research and writing outside the academy. Mike not only fits the description of an embedded thinker who uses years of practical experience to explain things that confuse the rest of us, but is something of our fellowship's ideal type. I'm trying to make a question. We support research showing that economics is not our fate, that we can change our fate by telling the truth about our actual lives, the lives of all of us. So many thanks again for your work and your thinking, Mike. And it's a real pleasure to turn it over to you.
And I'm going to start by thanking Chris and the ISRF for organising the event and for the support provided whilst I was writing the book. I'm, of course, really pleased to be talking about this book in Burnley. I'm particularly pleased as well that Afra Saeed and Manjit are also speaking to open the discussion. The book On Burnley Road tracks key issues in this town's politics over the last 25 years. The narrative really starts back in the mid-1990s with the emergence of a group of independent councillors, so-called, around a character many people in this room will remember, Harry Brooks. At the time, that felt like a local peculiarity, something weird that was happening in this town, this small group of independents. But looking back now, I see it as an early expression of a kind of detachment, a de-alignment of a significant section of voters from the Labour Party, not just locally, but it's a pattern that's happened many towns in Northern England. And the book looks at the way that some of the themes that were built up around Brooks's politics and his colleagues then formed the backdrop for the riots, the disturbances that happened in this town 20 years ago this year in 2001. And then looks at the successes of the far-right British National Party in winning council seats in Burnley in the early 2000s. At the first place, this was where a group of BNP councillors were elected, and they were initially making use of political space, opportunities that had been opened up previously by the independents. Those controversial developments fixed this town's reputation for troubled race relations for a good 10 years. And as Chris says, what I try and do in the book is explain, or try and explain, why it is that those politics emerged here. What was the context for those controversial developments? And the main argument I put forward is that the main context and the driver for it was deindustrialization, the loss of jobs, the decline of manufacturing, something that had been happening long term for the traditional so-called industry of cotton, goods manufacture and in coal mining, but then happened here in a very concentrated way. It was visited on Burnley job losses and factory closures in a sudden and deliberate, concentrated way in the 1980s. There's descriptions in the book of the numbers of jobs that were lost, good manufacturing jobs with very few and part-time and insecure service sector jobs coming up in their place to replace them. And that had a big impact in terms of reorganizing the way that life happened in towns like Burnley. More importantly than the simple fact of jobs and factory closures, there was a mixture of emotional and psychological and political responses to those changes. And there was a lot of hurt and upset that were kind of formed into a kind of set of resentments and sullennesses and denials. These weren't inevitable, they weren't natural. They came about as a result of different things, but one of them was the significant defeats that were suffered in the 70s and the 80s by the labour movement. The trade unions being hollowed out and diminished, the difficulties of the Labour Party in keeping connected to the constituency that it had assumed was there for it to represent, and therefore some of the difficulties were, if you like, pushed onto the town and to its political organisations, but some were self-inflicted. They resulted from a failure, a lack of imagination, a lack of commitment to ongoing dialogue and those who would represent people in Burnley really keeping in touch with and understanding what was going on. And these kind of resentments, these hurts were connected to instead by the independents and then by the BNP. They were fostered and they were articulated into racialized resentments. The explanation for why you felt dislocated, why you felt change in the town had been negative was directed against Asian heritage residents of this town in relation to initiatives such as regeneration. So earlier today, driven Chris around parts of Burnley Wood, parts of Stoneham and Daneshouse, and was explaining how in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, one area was being presented as neglected and left out, and another area, Stoneham and Daneshouse, was being presented by racist politicians as having funds and goods and gold and lavished upon it and showered upon it. The areas are similar. The areas face similar issues. The people that live there are facing the grind of making their lives, holding their jobs, getting their kids educated, and living in housing, often which is equally good or equally poor. But those divisions were fostered as a result of those politics in the late 1990s, early 2000s. The book also looks at many of the responses that there were to these developments, and I'm really delighted that there's so many people in this room this evening who personally played a big part in some of those responses. So the response of mainstream political parties, I highlight the way that the Liberal Democrats in the early 2000s repositioned themselves, having previously really operated under the shadow of the dominant Labour Party. The Lib Dems repositioned themselves as a mainstream alternative to Labour, and that actually drew a lot of the votes of people who wanted a different kind of politics in the town. The Labour Party quite quickly began recognising we need to connect to the people that we are seen as not listening to. So instead of walking away, people say they're voting BNP, ask them, why are you voting BNP? What are the frustrations? What are the concerns that are leading you in that direction? In the room with trade unionists and others who were involved in grassroots anti-racist initiatives, people that were involved in the voluntary sector, in the interfaith network. I personally focus in the book on the way that Burnley Council as an organisation was affected by and responded to these events, including through the Housing Market Renewal programme, Elevate, and through innovative community cohesion work, such as the Good Relations Programme for Sajda and Naveen's key people, Ali as well, who were involved in all the work that we did through that. And of course, I was employed at the council, involved in this work, employed holding politically restricted posts. Of course, while I was doing that, I did have my own political views, questions, confusions running in my head all the time. And what I've been able to do with the support of the ISRF is write some of those into the book that we're talking about tonight. I'm conscious that there'll be many people in this room who won't share some of the arguments that I put in here. Leftist criticisms of the Labour Party, of which I am a member, ongoing opposition to Brexit, which I see as a big mistake, including for this town. But you don't have to, I think, agree with my particular political views to be sympathetic to the main arguments that I'm putting out here. The first one, that what happened in this town in the 2000s was not only significant for Burnley, but had national significance. This was a place where some of the themes which have reshaped English and British politics over the last decades first surfaced in their current form. I remember back in the early 2000s, we used to have civil servants and researchers and journalists getting off the train. Many of them assumed that for a town to have had the riots we suffered, to have far-right politicians on the council, the place must be a basket case. There must have been a catastrophic failure of management. People must not be doing the right things. Not so. Good people were working hard to address this town's needs. But what was really going on, it pains me to say it, was that Burnley was just a precursor. It was a harbinger, sign of things yet to come, in which politics were going to be increasingly shaped by antipathy to immigration, antipathy to others, a shallow, narrow conception of nationalism and opposition to something called Europe. These themes, which were then picked up and articulated in slightly more polite forms by UKIP and Farage, and then fed into the Brexit vote, very strong here. And of course, those views have now been incorporated into Boris Johnson's variant of the Conservative Party, which in 2019 had a member elected here representing this town. The second main argument is that in spite of all those controversial developments and developments which I see as negative, my argument is that many of the very positive things that have been pioneered or done well in Burnley are precisely some of the things that need to be done more widely and more deeply in order to move things in the right direction. Partnership working between different agencies and between agencies and the community in a way that businesses and voluntary sector organisations and the council and other public sector bodies make the most of the too limited agency and resources which they have in spite of very challenging circumstances. And the way in which, and you used the word plain talking earlier, Chris, the way in which people in this town say things as they see them, plain talking, honesty and exchange of views in order to recognise the challenges that we face, but have an honest exchange about, well, what are the issues, what are the problems, what shall we do about them, always must be part of the way forward. That's what I want to say in introducing things. I'm looking forward to, after I say it, I think, speaking next. But Chris.
Yes, thanks, Mike. The program is this. We are going to have 2 responses. Then we're going to open it up for questions. We will have some questions online, but you all are in the front of the line, so love to hear your thoughts and reactions to what you've been hearing for about another 10 or 12 minutes or so. Food will be served in the back. Buffet it's about 6:30, and the bar will continue to be open as it currently is. So please help yourselves at your leisure. We're quite fortunate to have Councillor Anwar here with us tonight. I found a proper, I mean, this may be redundant here, but I found a biography for him just before the start of it. I'm going to read pieces of. He was first elected as a Burnley Borough Councillor in 2018. He's appointed leader of the council in May of 2021. His career job is with Lancashire County Council, where he has been employed since 2012 as a manager in the Education Improvement Service. And he has a varied career, including time as a consular assistant at the American Embassy, sports development roles at Hinburn Borough Council, Burnley Borough Council, and Blessed Trinity Romantic Catholic College, and as the faith coordinator at the Burnley and Pendle Faith Center. Councillor Anwar grew up in Burnley and has spent the whole of his adult life living and working in the Burnley area, committed to raising aspirations and community engagement. He is currently chair of governors at Barden Primary School, building bridges in Burnley, and a long-serving trustee at Burnley Gosia Mosque. Among other commitments, he has recently taken on a role of trustee at Burnley FC in the community. In 2018, Councillor Anwar was awarded an MBE for services to Burnley in Her Majesty the Queen's New Year's honored list. And it goes on. He's also a columnist, which is the first thing that I found, both of which I recommend. There's quite a nice one recently on Remembrance Day and the varied folks that have served in the British military over the centuries. Councillor, thank you for being here. I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I first got a call asking if I would speak about Mike's book, and I don't know how to say no, so I said, yeah, of course I will. And then I realised I hadn't read the book. So I had to speak to our officers at the council and get hold of a copy of the book, and then obviously read as well. So I don't think that, other than policy papers, I don't think I've actually read a book for quite some time. So that was the first task that I had to do. Before I speak about the book, I just want to say that one of the first things that I remember, and this book took me back to whilst reading it, was that I think it was 2011. There was some disturbances or riots taking place in the south. I think in North London, and I remember with our history and what had happened here in 2001. I remember sitting, many of you will know Father Peter Strickland, and we were just having a discussion, and I said, Father Peter, do you think this will trickle up and come to us here in Burnley? And he looked out the window and said, no, it's raining. and he was absolutely spot on. One of the key reasons for why we had the disturbances in 2001 was because, added to a lot of issues, one of the reasons was we had a heat wave that year as well. If it was mentioned in the book, I've missed it, but I think that one of the things that played into it, alcohol, other things obviously play into that as well. And so, you know, when we saw in 2011, and we were talking about that, joking aside, it wasn't just that it was raining that day or for that week, and it didn't come up to us here in Burnley, but it was also the good work that had gone on and what we'd done as a town in our fight back against some of those issues that we faced as a town. And we had the relationships to ensure that something like that never happens again. And every time something happens, first thing we do is we pick up the phone to one another, which is something that we didn't do in 2001. Now, bringing it back to the book itself, and I'm glad both Chris and Mike said, you know, we're a town where we're playing talking, and so I'll try to be as honest as I possibly can be about my sort of reading of the book and what I understand it as. And we're in Turf Moor, we're in a football stadium or a ground. So I want to use a footballing analogy and just say that football is all about opinions. And I think when we're reading this book, every single one of us will have our own opinion and our own perspective. And I respect Mike's perspective of where he was as a council officer and the position that he was in. But I was also part of the town and seen it from a very different angle. And so my perception of sometimes the things that I saw as part of that, I agree with many things around some of the conversations that will have taken place with the BNP and some of those councillors and characters that were involved in that. But also, I think, were the disturbances all about race? I think it was to do with deprivation, it was to do with poverty and things. And then when things like that, when there's high unemployment, there's always a scapegoat. There's always someone to blame. And with the heat wave and throwing the alcohol and other little things going on up in other areas similar to ours, and what that sparked was obviously the disturbances that we had. But were they necessarily about race? I think things might have been brewing a little bit, but I don't think they were necessarily about race. But what happened were the characters that then saw that as an opportunity to take advantage and make it about race. But also, that also coincided with 9/11. And I think this is something maybe that could have gone into the book. And the reason I say that is that in the same year, obviously in September, we had what happened with 9/11. And that changed the rhetoric as well. It changed the whole dynamics, because what it did for us, for those of us who are Muslim and Asian heritage, it made it not just about race, actually about Islam and about religion. And the reason I say that is I grew up in this town, and I remember growing up, and I always went to school identified as British, but always seen as of Pakistani heritage or Asian heritage. But then when I worked in education, one of the things I found with young people that I worked with who were born post 9/11, they identified themselves as Muslim, not as Pakistani or as Asian. So that was something else that was playing out, and it started to become something that was about Islamophobia and about religion as opposed to being something about race. And I think that's something, again, that needed to be focused on. And it's important that we recognise that as well, and people taking advantage. And then the other thing, as lots and lots of good projects that took place, and it's touched upon with the work that Building Bridges in Burnley did, and there is a mention of that. But my feeling was that I think sometimes the work of interfaith groups, and I'm not just saying this because I'm chair of Building Bridges in Burnley, but it's because I think sometimes the work is underplayed. And I mentioned right at the very start that in 2001, we didn't have those relationships where if something happened, I could pick up the phone to a local vicar, to a local imam, anybody from our local faith leaders, community leaders, and have those relationships. Whereas in 2011, we had that because I happened to be sat with the local vicar. And those were conversations that we could have. And I think more could have gone on, especially with the work that went on. I know there's a mention about organisations like Mediation Northern Ireland. Again, elements of that and different perspectives on that, and a lot has been spoken in the book about the contribution that they made. But my perspective was one of a different one. I'm not a big fan of consultants or people being parachuted into the town telling us how we should improve ourselves. I think we've got the right people, the right skills, and the right characters in our own town who actually know what the issues are, who should be able to deal with that. And what it does is that we don't need specialists coming in and telling us. And that's my view of how things could have been done differently, and we could have been equipped as opposed to having so-called experts telling us how we can improve ourselves and improve our town. But as I said, it's all about perspectives. We're all in this room here today. We'll hear different things, and every single one of us will take away something different, and that's to be respected. In terms of the conclusion of the book, and there's lots that's told as part of the the narrative of it. I think it was more about Islamophobia over the past, especially those first early 10 years, but then the way that we fought back as a town, particularly through community organisations. And then post 2011, what we found is actually all those organisations that were funded because we saw lots and lots of attention, all those organisations that were there because the funding was there, after 2011 all disappeared. But who's there now is the real grassroots organisations. And they're the ones that actually deserve to be funded and equipped now, because they have got the resilience and have got the skills to actually take our town forward. And in terms of concluding where we are now and the conclusion of the book, I think from my point of view, and I might have misread this, but my understanding was that we've not improved as a town, or we've still got those same issues. And the fact that the Red Wall areas constituencies collapsed as a result of obviously in 2019. Again, my experience of that is slightly different, and there were three things I think that played into that. One was Brexit. We were knocking on doors, and the first thing we were having to second guess what somebody would say when they opened the door. You had to second guess, are they pro-Brexit or anti-Brexit? We couldn't quite work out. The second thing that we had on the doorstep, again, we had to second guess, sort of see what response we were going to get to our leader. They either loved him or they hated him. And then the third thing, I think, and the most important one, which is our role, is that we did take people for granted. We took people for granted, and when I say we, I'm talking about us as a Labour Party, as a Labour group. We took people for granted, and that's something that we've got to fix. And we've got to try and pull that back. So from a political perspective, I think that's important. So those were the three things. And what's happened with again, taking advantage, what's happening is this populism that we've seen a rise of. And it's playing into that rhetoric of uniting people around that. And so we've lost that, the vote that's referred to as the white working class vote has merged with into one. It's our job through hard work to pull all of that back and build that back again. But in terms of where we are as a town, are we still where we were 20 years ago? 20 years ago is a lifetime away. I work with young people, and we don't even mention what happened in 2001 because it doesn't mean anything to them. I'm concerned about, what I'm interested in, is that we stood in Burnley Football Club, a Premier League club. In my lifetime, I didn't think we would ever be a Premier League club. And then when we first got promoted, and then got promoted again, that's something to do. But we're a Premier town. We're not just a Premier League, we're a Premier town. Everything that's going on in our town. I attend Lancashire leaders meetings, and I know that there are leaders looking, how are Burnley punching above their weight? How are they managing to do this? Whether it's levelling up, whether it's the Pioneer Place, whether it's Charter Walk, we're punching above our weight, and we will continue to do so. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Councillor. Our second respondent is Manjit Ramgotra, who was senior lecturer in political theory in the Department of Politics and International Studies at SOAS in the University of London, as well as an ISRF Independent Scholar Fellow affiliated with the Department of Politics at Queen Mary. Her research chronicles a history of republicanism extending from classical Europe to 20th century anti-colonial political thought. She is a strong advocate of decolonizing the curriculum and has co-edited a book on decolonizing curricula and pedagogy in higher education, which has just come out this year. Currently, she is working on a project on post-colonial republicanism and co-editing a political theory textbook called Reconsidering Political Thinkers. Anji, thank you for coming.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I might need the mic. Thank you very much for inviting me, and Mike, thank you immensely for the book. This is a really important book. It's a fascinating book, and I highly recommend it. The book brings together meticulous research combined with personal experience over many years and a real in-depth understanding of issues, and more importantly, of constituents and the problems that they face regarding unemployment, growing inequality, worsening poverty, blocked ambitions, lack of a future vision, and a deep, deep sense or frustration, a very deep frustration. Most insightful in the book is, or one of the most insightful parts of the book. The whole book is insightful, but one of the more insightful ones is the very end, where Mike ends with recommendations about how to regain the space that we've lost, a space in which we can come together with our differences and talk and converse with each other. Not necessarily to agree or to overcome the differences, but to hear each other and to listen to each other. And this is a space that we've lost, notably since the Brexit referendum in 2015, but things have been building up to that, where we can't come together in a room without tearing each other apart, so to speak. So I think it's really important that we try to regain that space, because our politics has become extremely polarized. And we're at a very critical moment where we need to be able to work together. We need to be able to find some sense of solidarity to confront the existential crises in which we're living at the moment. So I want to just talk a little bit about the conclusion of the book, where Mike gives some really positive recommendations about building community. And rebuilding our politics and a way forward. So he points to some steps where we might regain this space and build a politics of respect and solidarity despite our differences. Interestingly, he constructs this through a vision of a moral local politics. First, Mike argues that decision-making ought to be about social reality. It ought to address the real needs of ordinary folk at the grassroots level. And it should not be about spinning hypothetical or false narratives that the rich and powerful spin in order, and that they want the ordinary people to buy into in order to maintain their standing and privilege. So there needs to be some sort of a mechanism through which we can hear what those needs are and deal with what the real politics at the grassroots level is. And that we need to listen to, and we need to look around at the reality in which we live. Second, he recommends defending and imposing democratic structure, defending and improving democratic structures. I can't read my own writing. And maintaining high standards of office in order to rebuild a robust democratic culture that is inclusive and that, again, is built up from the local level. And I think I just want to pause on the notion of high standards of office. This is really important. And we've seen it like consistently being walked all over in the last little while, and just in the last few weeks with this, I can't remember the name of the politician who had his side job, but who was effectively being bribed by whoever it was who was paying him whilst in office. And this level of corruption that we have in the government is something that we need to be able to hold people in power to account over, but we also need to cultivate an ethics of high standards of office. I prefer that term than what is usually called the ethics of virtue. I think high standards of office is very good. Anyway, so we need to rebuild from the local level such that people can both access and participate in the democratic processes. And this is important, and it has to come at the local level because that's where we live, that's where we experience politics of the everyday, and that's where we confront all of our differences, etc. And so it's really important that we are able to participate in institutions at this level and build democracy up from there. He also recommends, interestingly, proportional voting over the first past the post system, so that we don't get governments that represent only a minority of the population and yet have a majority of parliamentary seats. So I think that's a really important question, an issue that we need to work through as well, because we did have that referendum in, was it 2010 or 12? Well,
It's just after the coalition case, so 2011, 2012.
yeah, sometime around then. Anyway, we did have a referendum then that didn't bring any results. So, but it's something that's still up for grabs, I think. Third, Mike recommends revamping, again, as I said, local government and the notion of community that exists at this level. And he also recommends that what needs to be done is that we need to finance this properly. So the money that had gone into supporting local government has dwindled and has come down to very little. So that needs to be revamped. And in that way, then local populations can attend to the everyday needs of the community. That is to say, everyday needs that are of public concern, from garbage collection to education and housing. These are really important public goods in which we all have a stake and we all need to have a voice. They can't just be frittered away into private companies to provide these services for us. And it really, I think, education and housing and healthcare are very important public goods that, and the welfare state as well, that we've seen that have, the funding, to use another term, they've been defunded since 2010, if you like, or since Thatcher even. So I think it's really important to renew financial support for these areas. Sorry, I'm living on what you've said in the book, I think, Mike. And finally, he contends that the effort to rebuild our towns and cities, and of course our democracy, ought to be at the local level, because this is the space in which diversity and commonality are negotiated. We understand and know our shared ends at the local level, not in large autonomous involving the nation. We live and understand our difference in our local communities, and all ought to be welcome into these public spaces, or as Mike puts it, any organization and every individual who is prepared to participate should be welcome in such spaces, and supported to take part. For democracy consists in difficult conversations, dialogue, and learning. It is not about finding shared solutions, not sticking to our stances. Sorry, it is about finding shared solutions and not sticking to our stances. Excuse me. So this is the ground we've lost. This ground about finding shared solutions and not sticking to our stances. It's the ground where we can come together with our differences and listen to each other. But this does require sacrificing our interests. And it requires doing so in the interest of the common good. Yet we need this more than ever in our present moment of existential crises, climate change, a global pandemic, a politics that is increasingly polarized, and where we are unable to share political views without, again, getting into very vociferous arguments and beyond, as Mike shows in the book. At the same time, Mike insists that it is through the construction of a collective will, through difference, that we need to address racism and class inequality. And I think that's really important, this idea of being able to come together, articulate our differences, and find a collective way forward, such that we have a collective will that we can live together in solidarity and in peace, and with our differences and different ways of being and living as well. So thank you very much for this really excellent book. Thanks.
Well, I think the thing that's happening here is exactly what we're hoping, which is that the arguments that are in the book stimulate discussion and debate. And there are differences of opinion and emphasis between myself and Marcus on a number of things here. But what I think we're both concerned with is this issue about people feeling like they can influence and kind of connect to the processes that are affecting their lives. My view is that the reason that proportional representation is a positive voting system is that it means that there's a kind of direct connection between the number of people who cast a vote for a particular party and or candidate and who they see therefore getting elected. It's the disconnect between how people vote and what they see as the result of that I think has fed into a sense of politics not serving people, and that's my argument. We'll disagree on, if you like, the tactical outcome, but the concern, I think, is the same. Similarly, on Brexit, I'm very clear that people who voted Brexit did so for many different reasons, and I certainly don't think that everybody who voted Brexit is a right-wing bigot or a racist or holds opposition to Europe in a kind of narrow way. But unfortunately, I do think those views were the main drivers of the Brexit vote. And those of us who had a left-wing reason for voting Brexit, Alexit, effectively ended up reinforcing the politics of Farage and Johnson, in my view. That's going to be a controversial statement. I'm comfortable with the fact that it's controversial, but the thing that we've got to do is, if you like, step back from the polarized positions that we might hold and say, well, what are the concerns and the reasons and the issues that underlie these different positions that we might hold that we do have shared opinion about? And I think there, the main things that Marcus was talking about, I entirely agree with. The way in which there's this challenge, and I don't see it as just for the Labour Party, for anybody who's wanted to find positive ways forward to make the right alliances and the connections between the white working class, the Asian heritage community voters, the so-called kind of woke students in the metropolitan areas. How do you connect and overlap and align different emphases and different points of view that people have, so that you create a broad alliance for positive change that actually goes well beyond the ranks of the Labour Party as well, but isolates those that are taking the country and or communities in negative directions? That's what I wanted to say. Certainly agree with all the points that Alex was making about social media and the way that that kind of can reinforce division and people just listening to their own views in echo chambers, and that is a challenge that to some degree is offset by the kind of grassroots community life that everybody here, that Councillor Anwar spoke so clearly about. I agree that the work that Jason Hunter and many other people did through Hope Not Hate and other grassroots initiatives built up exactly the kind of connections that we're talking about. But I do want to say that even whilst it's very important that even whilst you're campaigning against the views that the BNP were promoting, and which are still around in a diluted form and expressed now, and more recently through some of the UKIP themes and now some of the views that come out from the Conservatives, even whilst you're campaigning against those views, my position is that you need to be curious about, interested in, and sympathetic to the concerns of the people that are voting that way. So to kind of say these are racists that we defeated, I can understand being said from an anti-racist campaigning point of view, but my position would be people that voted BNP in this town, or people who voted that way out of concerns and hurts and frustrations, which are precisely the things that progressive people, the Labour Party, other progressive politicians need to connect to, not to indulge the racism, not to endorse divisive views, but to say the reasons and the frustrations that you were trying to express are things we're interested in, and what we want to do is find a different way to channel them. And I sometimes think this anti-racist sloganeering of saying these are racists that we need to condemn and defeat jumps over that importance of understanding why. I remember speaking to Julie Cooper, who was a former council leader and then became the town's MP for a while, and she talked about how in the early 2000s, Labour canvassers, if somebody said we're voting BNP, would turn around and say, I'm cutting this discussion short. If you're voting BNP, I don't want to talk to you. But then they made a change and they said, instead of walking away, ask why. Look for reasons why you can connect, even if somebody's saying things that you find offensive and you disagree with. There will be something that you can relate to, show that you're listening to that, and that's the way to start building up trust again. Exactly what Councillor Amwell was saying, the importance of listening and connecting. Housing market renewal was a programme funded by central government. The new Labour government put in millions of pounds into East Lancashire and a number of other places like it in order to address trends in the housing market, which made this area untypical in terms of the country overall. One of the things that was happening in Burnley in the late 1990s and into the 2000s was that house prices were dropping, and that was because of low demand. There's a number of people in the room, including you, Simpson, who were part of looking at what was going on in the local economy and what was going on in the housing market. And the Housing Market Renewal Programme was mainly centred on programmes of purchasing houses in areas of low demand, including compulsory purchase, doing demolition of blocks of traditional terrace properties, and then using the cleared sites to work with private sector developers to put new houses on there at a lower density of a kind that people wanted to buy. And you can see the physical and positive results of that in areas of town, including Stonewall Danes House, Princeton Road, Burnley Wood. The funding stopped when the new Labour government was replaced by the coalition about halfway through the intended programme, so it didn't do as much as it should, but it certainly helped as one of the things that helped turn around, and picking up on a point that Councillor Amwell was making, that began turning this town in very positive directions. The population decline, the trends for property values to fall were stabilised and reversed, and this place became known as a place where you could get good quality housing at good value, together with the investment in the local economy and some improvement in job prospects that really helped rebuild the town's population. So I see housing market renewal and write it up there as an entirely positive intervention by the government, by the council that works with the government and agencies on it. The way in which it helped build social cohesion was, first of all, in addressing, if you like, a concrete nuts and bolt issue of poor quality housing and people's lack of confidence in the housing market, but also Elevate, the Housing Market Renewal Programme, funded the Good Relations Programme, which was centred on people coming in from Northern Ireland to, if you like, share some of their approaches and their skills in addressing community tensions, but was very much also about giving and skilling up local people to be able to do that in a sustained way. And I think that had a very positive effect as well. I guess the intention of Max Steinberg and his colleagues at Elevate was to show that turning around the housing market wasn't just about bricks and mortar. You had to do some good community work, and that's what they decided to commission So to do. And I think also take your point about people parachuting in and parachuting out. Some good things came from that. On the issue of effective failures by the Labour Party creating space for the far right in the context of austerity, I just need to recall that the emergence of the far right in this town happened in 2001. So before what are now called the austerity policies. My view, probably a point of agreement with Marcus here, is that one of the problems that was going on at that time was the new Labour government had come into power. Tony Blair had come into power in 1997, and there were a lot of promises being made about that things will only get better. Cool Britannia was the kind of slogan at the time, but by the early 2000s, that had not translated into reality in Burnley. In fact, the level of income of the average household was declined still into the early 2000s. And the regeneration programs, including housing market renewal that we have mentioned, had not yet kicked in. So part of the context for the emergence of the far right at that time was a mixture of new Labour's policies not yet hitting the ground in Burnley and the old Labour, if you want to put it that way, style of the local council being detached from many local voters. Now, I think to bring the thing forward, the problem, I think, for the Labour Party in the context of the austerity policies pursued by Cameron and Clegg was something that I think has been illustrated in the room tonight. There's a real difficulty and a dilemma for politicians, including politicians like Councillor Elmore at local level, and anybody who's trying to run a council from the Labour Party or the Lib Dems in a context of Tory run national government, which is that at the same time, you've got to kind of talk about the problems that you face and, if you like, make the case for your town's funding on the basis of need, and at the same time, to talk up the positives and to emphasise the good things that are going on, because that's important to people's confidence. If you like, talking positively helps attract investment. And it's very tricky to get the balance right between saying things as they are and facing up to problems, and what you might call boosterism and emphasising the positives. Maybe I'm bending the stick the other way at the council, but we might have paid well to talk up the positives, quite rightly. Maybe in this book, I've bent the stick a little bit towards emphasising here's some of the challenges. Actually, we need to do both. When we're promoting the good things and pushing a positive narrative for our town, That's the right thing to do, as long as we always remember actually the risks and the problems are there. And I think that was what was reflected in the way that Labour nationally handled the austerity. You want to emphasise the positives, but that can fall into the trap of going along with negatives. This thing about social media fueling division, distrust, people withdrawing from interaction with other people is a real trend. We need to counter it by opportunities for discussion and interaction, the grassroots community life that people have been talking about. My view is there are things that you can do on social media. You don't have to fuel the polarization. You can find ways sometimes to get into conversations with people on Twitter or wherever that do suggest calmer ways of thinking about issues, but it is a major problem. The way to go in it is to resist the temptation to disagree with the comment that somebody's made, but to ask them, why are you saying that? Tell me, like, when did you start thinking that way? Be genuinely curious and listen out for the things that you can sympathise with. Because if you just say, that's racist nonsense, I totally disagree with you, well, you've made your statement, you've made your views clear, you've got that moral high ground, but you've taken yourself away from any chance of influencing the person. If people in Rishton and Accrington are saying divisive, hateful things that you and I will both strongly disagree with, and we're interested in changing that, the way to do it is to connect into what are the emotions, what are the feelings, and as you get talking to people, often you'll find something that you can strike a chord with them on, even though they're coming out with such hateful things. That's the first step I would suggest, but it's a bigger question than that, and it's not always easy, of course. Sorry.
I mean, I don't think it's rocket science, right? If you are elected by the people, then you should be accountable to them and exercise your duties in office in those terms for the public good, as it were. But I also think that part of the problem with democracy is that elections cost a lot of money. And so people get elected to office, but they become accountable to the people who are financing them rather than to the electorate. So I think there's this sort of, they're in a position where they've got a divided loyalty, and therefore you can be easily corrupted. But yeah, no, I think the ethics of virtue or of a high standard of office is really important. So pass on to you. No, that's okay.
The comment I would make about this issue is that if you want to look for examples of high standards in public office and a kind of evidence of politicians serving the local communities, don't look in the first place to Westminster, although there's very many good politicians in Westminster. Look to places like Burnley Borough Council, Rossendale Council, Pendle Council. Councillors that are in this room and others like them from all the political parties are working really hard at grassroots level for tiny allowances, putting in hundreds and hundreds of hours of unpaid voluntary work every year, connecting to the local communities that they represent, getting involved in local organisations, going to meetings at Burnley Council and talking about how to address the issues with spending resources. In some cases, going to even more interminable meetings in their own political party groups to kind of work out what the line should be and how to handle things. all the time, working in line with requirements and expectations, which are far higher and more moral, bluntly, than the ones that the MPs seem to be working on. The standards that Burnley Council follows are higher than the ones that Westminster follows. It seems to me, and that's part of I think where we should look and talk up and praise the role of local councillors as such, regardless of whether or not you agree with the particular politics that they're promoting. One of the reasons for the importance of local councillors, and here I'll just do a little bit of a different emphasis than my friend Chris Keane, is that I think the problem with the participatory budget principle and the idea that everything needs to be decided at local community level is that there are always hard choices to be made in local politics about how do you share resources and balance resources across the borough. Stoops is not a wealthy part of Burnley. Burnley as a town is not wealthy as compared to other ones, and therefore decisions need to be made about the reallocation of resources across wider geographical areas, and that involves striking balances that can't just be made at grassroots local level. And so the role of, I think, local politicians in areas like Lancashire are crucial in as the site really where those decisions get made. That's brilliant. So thanks.
Thank you, Mike.